Hey, Red Clay Rambler fans, we just passed the 9th birthday of the show, so to help celebrate that, I'm asking you to contribute $9 to support our new season. You can get involved by making a donation through the PayPal portal at talesofredclayrambler.com/donate, or you can make a monthly pledge at patreon.com/redclayrambler. If you join Patreon today, you can access perks like t-shirts, water bottles, and other podcast swag, as well as having access to the Patreon-exclusive Tales from the Vault podcast, which features remastered episodes that are no longer available on major podcast apps. Thanks for listening and being a part of this Red Clay Rambler community. With your support, I can keep the show rolling into its new 10th season. So thanks again, and let's get on with the show. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 377 of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. This week we are doing Canada Week, which features 5 Canadian artists that are helping to shape the landscape of ceramics in that country. Today's interview is featuring Kaitlyn Brennan, who is a potter based outside of Ottawa, Ontario. She makes a line of terracotta pots that are decorated with vibrant floral patterns and pop imagery. She is also the director of the Gloucester Pottery School, which offers ceramic classes in the Ottawa area. If you guys would like to see examples of her work, you can go to CaitlynBrennan.com. This week of interviews featuring Canadian makers is part of the run-up to the Ceramic Congress. Canada is the host country for this international online conference, which is starting today, May the 27th. If you're listening to this the day it comes out, I'll be interviewing Greg Pace and Katrina Chater tonight on the main stage, May the 27th at 7 p.m. I'd love to have some Red Clay Rambler fans in attendance for that, so I hope to see you there. You can find out more information by going to the Ceramics School's website and search for the Ceramics Congress. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Well, let's start talking about ACAD and how you ended up going to school there.
Yeah, well, I didn't expect to go to school for ceramics. I was really talked my parents into art school with the idea of going into design. And so I'd really looked at the Alberta College of Art and Design and the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, like both opposite sort of sides of the country from Ontario. And NASCAD seemed really great, but like the building was all spread out, all these little different buildings at that time. And Calgary, it was just one building, everything in one art school, and they were so organized, and that kind of did it for me. I'm like, it gets me out of away from all the family, gets me out of town, and then I lucked in. And the first year you had to take so many electives as part of our foundation program, and I was going to take glass blowing, and last minute I changed my elective to ceramics because I already had the tools because I'd taken some classes in high school. And had a class with our visiting artist that year, Hide Sarohara. I think that's the pronunciation of his name. It just blew me away. I'm like, I know my parents think I'm doing design, but I think I found my people, and I lucked in.
How long did you start taking clay classes before you told your parents you were going to switch?
I think I tried, like first year, they didn't really know. Second year, it's still like, you haven't declared a major yet really in second year. You're still taking classes everywhere, but I definitely started taking less in design and more in ceramics. And Oh yeah, I think it would have been at some point in second year that I was like, yep, I think design, I don't want to be stressed out every day of my life, which was that the program at ACAD is really intense, and it just looked like they're all ready to just cry into their beer at the end of the day. And I didn't want that. Not when ceramics is such a fun community environment and just such a good group of students and teachers that I knew that's where I needed to be.
So for a kid from Ontario, what is the perception of Calgary in the West in general? Like, is there an East Coast, West Coast divide like there is in the U.S.?
There is. Ontario's an odd place to come from because I guess we think we're the center of Canada. Like geographically, we're not even quite, but because we have the most population, we've got Toronto and the whole greater Toronto area. The West, you just think the Calgary Stampede and oil and like the getting into the mountains. So for me, I didn't really know too much about it. I'd visited Calgary once before on a 4-H exchange, and it seemed nice. I don't know. I think it seemed like a big city that wasn't too huge. For me, that seemed like a nice place to start coming from my small town.
So when it comes to moving away to go to art school, you get prepared in your mind like, okay, I'm going to go off and be an artist. And then you get sidetracked into clay, which ends up being, I would imagine, a sense of coming home. You know, like you said, you found your people. But some of ACAD at that time, the charm was the teachers that were there. So can you talk about who was there at the time and their influence on you?
So right off the bat, we had Katrina Shader and Greg Pace. They took turns being the head of the department. Greg took on a lot of the throwing classes. Katrina was our master hand builder. Greg was the nerd that made sure we knew glaze chemistry and how to make a clay body and all of that. Like they made sure we knew those fundamentals, but they were such caring teachers and they wanted to make sure that we got it. They weren't passing you along like, okay, you can kind of throw, you can move on. They wanted to make sure you knew the fundamentals so that you could take those tools and move on to anything. So with Katrina and Greg, like leading the pack, we had a lot of great sort of part-time teachers or sessional teachers. Barb Tipton, she's an American artist, has been in Canada a long time, former editor of Ceramics Monthly, just a great thrower, just this really sweet potter that really just had a really interesting approach to clay. I think just like her longer experience makes really, really great work herself, and her own work is really sculptural and like fragmented vessels, but could teach those fundamentals of throwing really well. Another sessional teacher we had frequently was Mariko Patterson. Really fun work. And just, I remember having her for an experimental ceramics class. And I was just like, oh, who's the tattooed student? And then to realize, oh no, that's the teacher. She was just always like, why don't you just do this crazy thing to it? Or why don't you do this? And there was no limit to what Mariko would suggest. And it was just a very different approach than like perfect, neat and tidy, like Greg and Katrina, whose work was so refined. Hers was willing to take chances, and sometimes things blew up, and that was just part of her process. A really amazing thing about ACAD that I don't know if any other school in Canada has is their visiting artist program. So every year they get a different visiting artist for the year. They teach a couple of classes, and then they get to work on their own work in a studio that's right in the middle of the ceramics department. And so my first year we had Hide, and he was just this inspirational teacher that got me clicked on ceramics. But each year you had somebody making a very different style of work, very different personality. Some of them you're going to love, so maybe you don't like, but guess what? They're only there for the year. And so I had pretty great teachers most of the time, but like my fourth year, we had Emily Schroeder in as our visiting artist. And she did so much for all of us. Like I couldn't say enough positive things about Emily and ACAD for having that kind of a program to not just expose us to like Katrina and Greg and Barb and Mariko, but every year we got somebody else. You had lots of different variety coming in. And I think that's why there's so many ACAD ceramics students or alumni that are still working in clay and doing really well with it.
I think it was either you or Carol sent me a list of all the potters, like functional working potters that have come out of ACAD, and there was 10 or more people, and that was just in the last, 5 years or 10 years or something.
Yeah, I'm sure if you looked at it, there's always names that I'm like, oh, I didn't realize. Like you forget about like Kathy Terapaki or some of these other names. You're like, they were all there. Some of them are, you know, they're like a little quieter, working away in their studios in whichever part of Canada, and they're doing like say wholesale production work, and it's really great. And then some are these artists that are exhibiting a lot and a really big voice on social media, like say someone like Sarah Pike, that you know Sarah Pike. Anywhere you look on the internet, you're like, that's one of her pots. So there's like a huge amount of variety. Not everyone found their path in doing, say, the gallery exhibitions, and that some are making the production lines and doing really well with that. And some of us over the years, we've done it part-time in sort of partnership with another career path, and they've all been successful. And I think it has a lot to this really strong foundation that the school made sure we had when we left.
Was the idea of being a functional potter celebrated? Like, why do you think there's so many functional potters that have come out of that school?
100% celebrated. Like, I know every year things get more and more positive towards craft and the word craft. But even then, I know like Katrina a few times is like, oh, I remember going to Nsika and you said craft. It's just like nobody was into that and they were upset at you. And so the program thoroughly embraced craft. That was not a bad word. Like, yes, you can make sculpture, you can make installation, and you can make pots. And they're all just as valuable and celebrated. 100% celebrated. Like, you learned how to make pots, you learned how to make functional glazes, you learned how to make pieces that are useful. You're not just making something that'll look good in a photo. Like, you made pots that there had to be this level of a care that went into them. Like, gosh, we hated Greg sometimes. He was really good at pushing us, but it was like third-year wheel throwing, and we would get an assignment. Okay, you guys are making 40 mugs this week. We're like, gosh, we're gonna have a meltdown on the number of mugs. He's like, the end of the week, okay, pick the best 10. Those go to the kiln. The other 30 go to the bin. And early on, it was all about the repetition and culling. And then next time, here's what you need to work on, or here, I want you to take it in a different direction. And I think that just even that approach of you need to do it really well is something that the teachers at ACAD taught really well. And I think that other schools in Canada, like NASCAD with Walter Ostrom, he taught both Greg and Katrina at one point, and he was the same way. Because anyone I've talked to that's gone through that program, they can make really great pots. And it's because it was valued.
We may not know all of the schools, but if we could, between the two of us, let's name the schools in Canada where you can study clay. So you've got Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. We mentioned that. Alberta College of Art and Design. Which
is Alberta University of the Arts now. It has updated its name. Katrina and Greg were instrumental in getting our university status. And then the last couple of years has changed, and they came up with a new name that not everyone loves, but that's the new name. The rest of us is ACAD. And then Emily Carr Institute of Design, I'm blanking on the title, Emily Carr in Vancouver. And then those are Sheridan College just outside of Toronto. Those are the degree granting programs that are coming to mind. There's a few more in the prairies that also do degrees. Is it University of Regina? And I think they have their masters as well. There's a lot that have college programs and diploma programs. Red Deer College, ACAD got a lot of students that would do a couple years at Red Deer and then come down to us. Kootenay School of the Arts, Robin DuPont teaches there. Katie Dryber, I think, teaches there a bit too. And they get a lot of people making really strong pots, and some of them will choose to then go on to ACAD. Like Katie Dryber, for example, I think she did that, and a few others.
Is there anything in Montreal? I'm trying to think. Is there
Concordia?
Concordia, right.
There's another program as well, and I think it's a French name, but Concordia is a really strong program. I've got a couple of staff that were educated there. There's probably a few others that I'm missing, and I'm going to think of them later.
Well, I wanted to call out their names because it's one of the things that's interesting about Canada. there is a appreciation for ceramic craft and craft history within the schools you just named that's not often the case even in U.S. schools that teach clay. Like the orientation is not towards craft, as you mentioned before. Did you guys get craft history?
Oh, absolutely. I definitely had craft history. We had a craft humanities class at ACAT. There was a lot of really talented lecturers that also worked at the school. Marie Perron, Jennifer Salahab was the head of the art history department. She has her PhD in craft in textiles. The school added a master's program after I graduated, and it's a master's in craft. It's the first one in Western Canada anyways. And so you can study jewelry and metals, glass, ceramics, textiles. So across the board, craft is celebrated at that school. And I think at many of the others out west. Ontario just recently, in the last few years, got a degree program. There was one at Ontario College of Art and Design years ago, and it was cut in favor of design. So Sheridan College had a diploma, and again, in the last few years, they've upgraded to a degree. But before that, all the Ontario college kids were having to go on to NASCAD or to ACAD to get their upgrade to the degree. So it's weird that Ontario had such a void. And out east, there's also New Brunswick College of Art and Design. I think it's like a diploma or a diploma program or a certificate program. I don't think they're degree granting. So East Coast and the West, the middle seems to be a bit of a void with Ontario.
I'm interested in schools that put craft history on the curriculum. That's something in the U.S. that's starting to happen a little bit more, but I feel like Canada's kind of led the way in terms of that. What do you think you got out of classes in which you were not making, but you were thinking about the history and being a part of a larger craft context?
I think it's so much. And I think a lot of it got you thinking about why you were making work, what its role was, and sort of like the anthropology of where that could play out in the future. They had a lot of really great textbooks. And I think that, and a lot of our teachers wrote for them, or there was articles about our faculty in it. So there's a lot of Canadian content, even just coming out in the craft textbooks. But I think when you go to like writing an artist statement or figuring out why you're doing something, sometimes you're just writing it for the sake of writing it. And I think taking these courses, it helped us really find our place to determine the value of the handmade and where our ideas and sort of our intentions with our work fit in. And understanding where our traditions are coming from, but also the contemporary way it's being used. Like say a lot of the textile work that's being used, social activism, like that was coming up in class and finding out how we can all be using these things. Or I think that it's really important. And it's surprising that not all schools do that, because it just seemed like it went hand in hand. It didn't seem out of place or that it was pioneering. It seemed like that it was logical.
It seems like there's an ecosystem of craft that starts in the schools. It actually starts before that in primary schools and people buying and understanding handmade objects. But the other end of that spectrum is the Canada Council and the grants that are to help support, artists that are making and working in craft. And when you pair education and post-education funding, good things can happen. And I know a lot of Canadian artists get grants. So Have you gotten a grant or are you familiar with that system at all?
Personally, I haven't utilized like a Canada Council grant, but they have them at all different levels. It's just even the city of Ottawa has a lot of arts funding for individuals, for organizations, for collectives, for all kinds of things. And the school I run is a nonprofit, and we're funded by the city of Ottawa through the arts funding program. So that's what keeps our school running every year and allows us to serve a really large part of the community. I think that it's amazing that the travel grants, they say Canada Council, and each province, like the Ontario Craft Council, and each of them have their own. I think how valuable those are. And they extend beyond just, hey, going to a conference. Is how do I get my artwork out there and exhibit it and travel and can bring that around, or to work on a big project that you're to just make it feasible. All these ways that I can't imagine looking at it now and be like, we wouldn't have all this culture without that. Like, it's important that they put that there and that Canada continues to support Canadian content, because it is tricky. We're a very large country, but our population isn't that large at all. So that they've decided like really emphasizing on putting a value in our culture is important in the development of art.
And when I talk to Canadian artists about their lives and how they have progressed in their work, they often will mention like in your case, that you're now running a school which is paid for by the city. Like there is a feeling of government support that I'm always pleasantly surprised at. But I wanted to kind of switch topics and talk about the things you did to educate yourself, like the post-bac you did at University of Florida. You also did a study abroad in Glasgow School of Art.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about the things that you kind of put on top of your undergrad to, I don't want to say finish you, because none of us are ever finished, but how did you use these programs to take the next step?
I'll start with like the Glasgow School of Art. So my school, along with many others, is part of this, I don't remember what the acronym stands for, it was ACID Mobility Exchange Program. And it allowed you to go and take a semester, 2 semesters at any other school that was part of it. And you were only paying the tuition you normally paid. So to go and be an international student can be very expensive, where I just had to pay my ACAD tuition. And then I got to do this semester in Glasgow. So for me, it was a really great opportunity to see a different culture, just even getting outside of Canada. But in ceramics, it was just such a different approach. Like I'm used to a big throwing room that everyone is using constantly, but their plaster room was where everybody was working. They had lathes going for plaster. They were making all their positives. They were making jigger jolly molds. And they were a lot more sort of design production focused. And not that I don't know if it directly impacted where my work headed, but it really opened my eyes to what was possible. And I'm sure for lots of people that enter that environment, that their work did change a lot because of it. And you learned these skills that you could take on. But even just learning to silk screen, like overglaze transfers, they had all of that there, and I hadn't done that before. So it was more of an industry focus that was really great. And Scotland has a lot of great ceramics, but Scotland was also going through a really weird period that the schools themselves had decided ceramics was too expensive. So they'd already cut the degree program at Edinburgh, and Glasgow was cut right before I got there. So they're grandfathering out the program. So I believe you can still study ceramics at Glasgow in a few schools, but you can't get a degree in it anymore. So since then, seeing how much they've brought on like apprentice programs and all these other learning opportunities to fill in for the number of schools that have been cut is really interesting. And I think that that's going to continue a focus on craft, because I feel like a lot of those apprenticeships have more of the craft focus or the production wares versus like maybe some of the more sculptural work that could sometimes happen in the schools.
How did you find the experience of coming to Florida? Because I had seen it written that Florida, I think you were the one that said this, Florida is about the exact opposite of Calgary in terms of climate, and that it was just like it was a shock as a human to go from, minus 10 in the winter to whatever we are, or whatever Florida was, hot.
Try minus 40. I think minus 40 is where Celsius and Fahrenheit meet up. That's Calgary in the winter. Not the whole winter, but Calgary is cold. It is colder than Ontario. It is a dry cold. You can say we get these Chinooks and it warms up, but Calgary is cold and dry. Even the summers are dry. They can get hot, but they're dry. And I was like, at that time I was thinking about grad school, and I was like, I don't really know if I'm ready for that. And fortunately, again, I had Emily Schroeder as this visiting artist in my 4th year who had done a post-bac that's like, hey, you should think about doing a special student program. Here's a bunch of schools that I know offer it. And I got looking through them. I'm like, well, like Montana, those look like really great programs. And I talked to them and I'm like, but that's kind of Calgary. Like Montana and Alberta have the same weather. Very similar. It's like, if I'm going to just go away for a year, let's do something different. And the program in Florida had looked really great. It looked like a nice change from the winter. And it was the exact opposite. That first day walking up to the school, I was just like, I've never seen my hair so curly. I've never been like, just the moisture, like Ontario is humid, but it's not Florida in August. it was something else. It was a whole different experience. You had drying cupboards where Calgary had damp rooms. Like Calgary, we had entire rooms of humidifiers running and like 12 layers of plastic to keep pots from drying out. Gainesville was the opposite. It was like, how do I get this bowl to dry out so I can do another caster? it was very different that way. Yeah, even politically, like just sort of demographic wise, Calgary is this oil city and it's huge and it's this urban sprawl. And then you get Gainesville that, yeah, there's a real mix of people, but you get a lot of like the students and artisty folks and the Hare Krishnas and just this crazy tight little community where everybody bikes everywhere and meets outside for like Krishna lunch every day of the week. It was just so different, just environments.
People from Florida will know Krishna lunch, but for the non-Florida people, Krishna lunch was when the local Hare Krishna temple would come and feed the students as an act of carrying their message or their love through food. And on a practical level, you could eat for, was it $2 or $1?
It was $4 when I was there, but it was still unlimited refills. It was all vegetarian, but super delicious. And it was like a great time to just get outside the studio for a bit.
Yeah, and there was a migration from the art school every day over to the other part of campus where the Krishna lunch was held. Like you said, everyone's eating outside on the lawn. So as a public mixing of people, which is possible Florida pretty much all year round because it's so warm and beautiful. But you had gone from Greg and Katrina to studying with, I guess, Nan and Linda were there?
Yep.
Can you talk about how your teachers have affected your aesthetic? Because I can see similarities in terms of process and material and love of pattern, but do you think that, say, having Linda and Katrina, that has made you the potter you are today? Or do you think you already had design interest and they helped to teach you how to carry those forward?
I think they both played a really large role in where my work is now. I don't think it was present at that time. Like, I was really into atmospheric firing and caught up in the flame and soda, but I wasn't missing what they were teaching. Like Linda would do a demo on like her Myelica and talk about surface, or Katrina would talk about how she built her surface in her slabs. I was listening and absorbing, and my process wasn't at that point. Like I was just like, what is soda? This is amazing. Like all this fire. And I was caught up in that. And I hadn't found a way to integrate the two. At Florida, I was definitely trying to bring some surface in, and I made a lot of ugly pots that year. And it just wasn't working for me. But all that was there. And so when I started to make the switch after returning to Canada to earthenware and realizing, like, oh, I don't have this kiln to make my surface look pretty, I've got to get into it a little bit more than I have been. It just kind of kept growing. And I think that's where those lessons from, especially Linda and Katrina, started to come through, sort of remembering back. But super valuable. And regardless of the surface, the way both of them talked about pots and the importance of considering each part and how it goes together is really valuable. Yeah, I just think back all the time, like, what would Linda say about this?
What would Linda do is a good thing to go through your head when you're making. I do the same thing.
It's so great. But she was also the first one, you were like working on something and she could see it. The next day she'd show up with a book or an article or an artist you should look at. And she'd taken the time to connect the dots. Like, this will be valuable to you. This will help you in whatever you're working through. And I was only a postbac, like really only was taking like 2 courses a term. You took the time to do that when you have all these grad students and all these undergrads, and you had like 10 of us postbacs that year. It was just, when do you have time to sleep? It's just such a valuable teacher.
So when you moved back to Canada and you decided, like, I'm going to be a terracotta functional potter, how did you put the studio together? Because you had to find clay, slip, and glaze, as well as, the practical stuff of wheel, electricity. Like, how did you get it all together and actually start?
Crying when I realized there was no soda kilns anywhere, or even wood kilns anywhere accessible to me. I didn't know what to do. I had a kiln that I'd got from a friend in Calgary and it had shipped home. So I'm like, okay, I guess I'm going to do electric. Okay, I'm used to doing cone 10. I could go to like cone 6 electric. And I was just like, you know what? If I'm going to do electric, I might as well go low temperature. If I'm going to do it, let's just go low. So I made the decision for earthenware, and there was 2 clay providers in Ontario, and I picked one with a red clay, and I'm still using the same clay body. And Tucker's clay out of Toronto is really nice, low red clay that I know a lot of Canadians use from Ontario to out east. Like Joan Bruneau uses that clay as well. I think Katrina Shader has used it. And I just got into tried testing all these glazes and slips. And eventually through the process of using those, I got more illustrative. It's just kind of a gradual progression over time. Each kiln load, there was something that would sort of click a little bit more. And I've reached a point that I use 1 slip, 1 clear, and the rest is all commercial underglaze. But it's still the same slip and same clear glaze that I picked for the clay body in that first year I was back. And they've worked, and why would I mess with that?
Well, I'm a terracotta maker as well, and I want to geek out on the glaze. Can you talk about what glaze you're using? Because I basically use the same scenario you just said, and I'm always looking for the next best clear glaze.
I use the Alfred Clear. I'd have to look up the recipe. I could definitely send it to you, but it's pretty straightforward. I think it's got like 3195 in it. It's NFSI. Yeah, it's very simple.
I used it a lot when I was in Florida and loved it. The clay body I'm using now, it has some fit issues, so I had to kind of change things up. But it's funny how in low fire, we're all wanting a specific surface, like because the clay is never going to vitrify, like you have to have your glaze game down like pretty tight, or else you can get into trouble. So can you talk though more about how your sense of pattern developed? You know, I got on your website and was looking through, you have a wholesale packet where you say like, here, I'm doing these 10 patterns. So it was very structured in that way. So can you talk about developing like a sense of multiple patterns that can be interchanged on the work?
It honestly just grew from somebody would ask me like, hey, can you make me these mugs with foxes on them? And I like do it. And then somebody else would ask for something and I would try it and some would click. And I'd be like, oh, yeah, mugs with pizza on them. That's fun. Like I think it's funny to draw and people seem to like them. And there was lots of kind of fun things I could do with that. So that would continue. And I definitely do stuff stay outside those kind of someone asks for something. I'm terribly slow, but I'll try to like, yeah, sure. You want something, a yarn bowl with your cat on it. I'll try to draw your cat and whatever other thing. And sometimes those click and they continue on to something else. It was really no structure to it. Is kind of what came up and which ones were easy to replicate and to continue. My go-to is florals, like the flowers I draw, I do the most of those. So when someone does a wholesale order and wants all florals, like that's great. That's my favorite thing to draw. Some of the other ones get a little fussier. For the wholesale, I tried to narrow it down to say 10 designs that I could sort of work with on most of my forms that were being ordered just for my own simplicity. And that's worked pretty well. Not that if someone said, hey, can you do bike mugs? I hadn't thought about it before, but there's a store in the Yukon that consistently orders bike mugs from me because they're popular up there. So it was just really what's fun to draw. If something's not fun to draw, I don't want to do it again. And there's all the time that I'm like, gosh, I got to put a little reminder that I got to try that on something and see how that works. And some things work well on all forms. Like I feel like the florals, there's different ways of changing the pattern around depending on what I'm making. And there's some things that I'm like, this works in a mug. But beyond that, I haven't figured out how to translate it to something bigger or to a different form.
How did you decide that wholesale was going to be one of the ways you would work? Because I feel like that is, in my mind, that's something that potters in the 80s did really well with. But in the U.S., it's not that people don't do it. They've backed off enough that schools don't really teach you to do wholesale. So how did you feel like wholesale was an option?
It was really social media. I had a couple of shops contact me and say, hey, I'd love to order your stuff from my shop. And I was like, oh, okay, you're still like, you're you get a 50% discount because you're ordering a bulk order. And it's no different than shipping to, say, a gallery where they're taking half for the work they do, except I get paid up front. I'm not sending it someplace and I know I've signed it out and I'm hoping it sells, so I get paid and I've got to keep track of what's where. The simplicity of, I sent you 40 pots, I get my half, and it's your problem to sell it. That's what drew me in, because I'm not organized enough to be like, this is here and plan it all out. So any of the wholesaling is just simplicity for myself. And I think there's a lot more people doing it wholesale. I know there's a few shops in the region here. They're actually sort of coaching people on how to put together wholesale packets of what you need or line sheets, and making it easier for artists and other makers to get their stuff into like Canadian made shops.
And I think financially, as you mentioned, you get paid up front. So it's a better deal than consignment. And it also is a practical way to get your work out there. I was working with an artist one time and they said the best advertisement for my pots is my pots. So if I can get them out into the hands of people at a reasonable price through shops, then why not do it that way? As opposed to trying to go to a higher end gallery market where you might sell less and less people will know about the work that way.
Absolutely. I find that the shops that are carrying my work are more like gift shops, or you're in the Yukon and you're buying Canadian made items. You're visiting from another country and it's kind of gift shoppy almost, but it's all Canadian made goods that are curated. I think that aspect is really nice. I don't just do wholesale. Like I've liked it. I do need to refocus on it. I've had issues. I think my prices have been too low, and sort of thinking on it now and looking at more artist work that might need to come up. And it's working with a few people I consistently do wholesale with to work with them on that as well. But the other thing is just the direct sales. I've been doing them through Etsy, which has been great, but I'm going to move it over to my website to do it there and not have sort of any in between, like dealing with galleries. So I'm not having to worry about inventory. I can say, okay, here's the 50 pots I have. I know they're in my house. I can put them there. And then when they sell, take them to the post office and they're done. So those are kind of the two options I focus on.
I wanted to talk about the way that you use pattern in your work, because you'll often have what I think of as like maybe 3 layers. Like you have the pot, then you have a texture, then you'll have a motif that is either pushed in or pushing out from the inside, and that's like a textural thing, separate from the fine scratch marks that you do. Then on top of that, you'll have a colored texture. So there's almost like 3 distinct layers. Can you talk about how you've learned to build interest in low-fire pots by creating all these layers?
Yeah, it wasn't an overnight situation. Like it started with more pots that I was just doing decoration, and then I'm like, oh, I'll add a layer of slip and then get into Sgraffito and add 1 layer of image to say it's 1 layer of flowers. One day I started just texturing the background. When I dipped it in slip, now you've got all this variety over the slip over the texture, and then drawing through that, it gave a little bit more depth. Because I think that's what I've been searching for in like electric fired work, is the depth that I could get in atmospheric kilns. It kind of grew from there when I started puffing out shapes. So I make these plastic stencils of, say, a flower, and then I can puff out the flower shape through the pot before I've dipped it in slip to add visual depth, but also just physical depth to the pot without like adding like an applique that would add weight to it. I didn't want to make it heavier, but I wanted to build that surface out. And then even through the texture, say it's flowers, I've textured up the whole background. I'll go in with just like a wooden tool and draw in flowers or little viney patterns, plus the puffed out sections. And then I'll dip it in slip. And then from there, then I can go in and do my normal Sgraffito, and then after it's been bisque-fired, I underglaze. I'm not opposed to adding more layers. I do really feel that more is more, and if I can get another layer of surface on there, I will. And so that's what I'll keep searching for, is how to build that and it work together and not be too busy. It was a several year process that I'd be like, oh, what about this? Oh, that does work, and kind of keep building from there.
Well, I like when you push out from the inside, like you said, it adds a visual presence without adding physical weight, which I've been trying to figure this out for years too, because I love sprigs, but sometimes sprigs and dipped slip can be tricky because if everything is not adhered right, things start to pull away and the slip cracks all this this issue. So pushing out from the inside solves that. It also does something to the form where instead of having a completely straight wall, it loosens everything and all of a sudden the pot looks a lot softer, which when you're making glossy pots, I think that's something for me that's important, is that they don't look too hard, because they already look hard because they're shiny.
Yeah, absolutely. I hadn't even thought about that part of it. I don't throw my mugs to match. Like, I roughly cut the same size pieces of clay when I throw, but I like that they're all different heights. And then depending on how I've altered each of them, puffed things out, they all look a little bit different, but it makes them cohesive in sort of their differentness, like across the board, if they're sitting on like a shelf at a craft fair that I've gone to, or just photos of them. I like that variety.
Part of your patterns, like let's say the rainbow pattern you do, like that's a lot of work. Like you have to paint each color. There's a lot of time there.
Yeah.
And then the floral patterns you can move through more quickly. But the wholesale price and ultimately the retail price, if you're selling it in the gallery or selling it direct, doesn't reflect that. So I noticed in the wholesale catalog, like the flowers cost the same as any other pattern. So how do you defer cost across a whole line when you're producing in this way?
I know that I sell more floral than anything else. So I know I can make them quicker than I can, say, bikes and rainbows. The bikes ones are awful because they are so time consuming to draw and paint all these darn little bikes. But I know I do the most floral, so it balances out that way. Like the prices I currently have on the wholesale definitely need to be revisited. I haven't made enough work recently to be utilizing that side of my business anyways. Like the last year, things have kind of been on hold, and the pandemic and new kids, my household has gotten very busy and not studio busy. So a lot of what I'm doing right now is actually reassessing like my process and the time that goes into these, and trying to determine where I need my prices to be to continue to make it feasible, because it is taking time away from my family and time away from the school I'm running. And I'm also very aware of, I need to know where the market is at for other artists that are making similar work. So I don't want to make work that's undercutting them or making people question the value of their work, where I do think that mine has been too low, and I don't want to do that. I think that it's very important that people are paid to match. And I have been prone to pricing things for what they'll sell in my community here locally. And I don't think, because it's not like an area with a big ceramics program, where if you're in Calgary, people know the value of a pot because you have so many ceramic artists there, and there's so many opportunities to see higher end craft. Where I am is not. I think that certain organizations out here allow their members to sell things really low. So I've had to sort of fight that. And I'm through the shutdown, been revisiting my own pricing and where I want my work to be. And if my work won't sell in Ottawa because my prices are too high, then I will sell outside of Ottawa, because I'm not prepared to sell my work at a lower price than what I think is comparable to my peers that are putting the same amount of work in it, because beyond my region, it's not helping ceramics even, and it's not helping ceramics here for not advocating for the appropriate pricing. So I think perhaps with that, there'll have to be that variation in pricing based on the amount of work in a pot. It is tough to, I think, communicate to your customer why it is. So I'd be interested in seeing what some other folks are doing that do have those variations that they're working with.
I think every couple of years in the U.S., I see this at conferences, like in Sika, people will be huddling around, and I'll walk up to see what they're talking about, and it turns out they're talking about the cost of a mug. Like, hey, what does your mug cost? And right now we're going into, inflation is starting to be something that's happening in the U.S. economy. So So I think this conversation is going to be happening again soon. I wanted to, though, go on a complete tangent away from work and talk about roller derby, because I know that's something that you've done. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about, on a practical level, like how do you start a violent, fast-moving sport as an adult?
I got started in roller derby because I came from Canada. We play hockey or we skate. Like that's just an option that a lot of us grew up with. And even in Calgary, if I wasn't playing hockey, I was skating. Leaving Canada, I'm going to Florida for a post-bac. You're an international student. You can't work legally. Post-bac program isn't the most demanding thing ever. Like you can get into it, what you get out of it, what you put into it. But I had a lot of free time. I knew I would have that because I couldn't work and I'd always worked all the way through school. So I was like, oh, I wonder if there's any like hockey anywhere down there. No, not a hockey rink for 100 miles. Okay, what about like roller hockey? No, not for women. And then came across roller derby. And it was like, I don't even understand these rules. So I Googled it. Like this is not long after the Drew Barrymore movie came out, Whip It. Like that was like my experience with roller derby at that point, which they're drastically different than flat track roller derby. But that was sort of the entry point. So I did my research and I contacted the team down there, like, hey, I'm coming down from Canada. Like, when's your like recruitment nights? And yeah, the first recruitment night it was about a month after I got down there. And I'd spent that month leading up to it on my roller skates, skating around a pond near my house, learning how to use wheels. And very different than ice skates. But I just remember showing up to recruitment night and like, oh yeah, well, like, why are you here? And I'm like, oh, from Canada. Like, yes, like nobody plays hockey down here. And they're like, guys, this is Canada. She plays hockey. Be nice to her. And I showed up to that recruitment night and got hooked. It was such a fun community, kind of like ceramics. You get a wide variety of people. They're really passionate about what they're doing. And it's a really great physical activity. Like it can look violent, but it's less violent than men's hockey for sure. And it's like women's hockey, but with body checking. Like you're allowed to use your body and throw your hips and make contact with someone else. Where in women's hockey, that's like really no violence. But it was really the community that got me hooked. I was in. I loved the people. I loved that we're working hard towards something. It was a lot of fun.
When you're playing roller derby, do you feel, let me think how to ask this. It seems as an observer that it's super dangerous because when the person hits you, you're then going to hit something else, whether that's, if you're on a bank track, you might hit the rail. If you're not on a bank track, you might slide out and hit a wall. Like, how much are you thinking about that the whole time you're playing?
Not at all. The sport, like, I didn't play bank track. There's really not too many bank track organizations. Most are flat track. And so within flat track, like, there's a whole organization. It's Women's Flat Track Roller Derby Association. It's international, but they set the rules and the guidelines for what the surface can be and how much distance around the track. So like it had to be like you couldn't have the edge of your track within a certain distance of a wall or a pillar. If it was close, to be padding. The game is really highly controlled. Like the rule book is so long. Like it was really set up to make sure everyone played safely. And at any one time, there's 10 players on the track. There's 7 referees.
Okay.
Those 7 referees are making sure that no one is hitting from behind or hitting below the knees or going the opposite way on the track and making contact. And you learn how to take a hit and you learn how to fall safely. Like those are the first things you learn at a roller derby program, a fresh meet, what most organizations will call it. But you learn how to fall safely. You know which gear to be wearing, to fall. So least impact is happening to your body. And then when you're learning to take a hit, you learn how to absorb the hit and not go flying. So they do set you up to be really safe. And I think they're so thorough because it's kind of this outsider sport. So many people come to roller derby because it's this sort of alternative look to it when they're coming into it. So it attracts people that have never played a sport before. And so I think that adds to the really interesting culture. In Gainesville, we got really lucky because Gainesville is such this interesting community that so many people come in and out of it for school that we had women that have gone into college on scholarships for field hockey and lacrosse and won national championships for women's ice hockey. That we had a good mix of people that never played sports before, but also really athletic women that were top of whatever sport they'd played and had transferred to roller derby. Again, it's so nomadic that so many of those women went on to other really high level roller derby teams across the country and did very well, went to championships and won all kinds of medals. Really, it's pretty amazing how talented that group was in Gainesville.
I believe you met your wife that way?
Yeah. So when I finished in Gainesville, I even snuck sort of back to stay an extra few months after the school year had ended because I wanted to finish out the season. I pushed it as long as I could on a student visa and then a visitor visa to finish playing roller derby because I loved the group and I was loving the sport so much. But when I came back to Canada, I didn't really know where I wanted to end up. So I ended up sort of back at my parents where I'm from, and the closest roller derby league was Ottawa, like 2.5-hour drive. Okay, I guess I'll go to Ottawa twice a week. And yeah, I met my wife in the league here in Ottawa. And after a bit, I moved to the city. And yeah, we're married with 2 kids now. And I'm definitely not the only person that's met their partner through roller derby. It's a good way to meet, especially when you're new to a city. It's a good way to meet other people like you that have the same interests and are, especially roller derby is often a very queer sport. It's a good way to meet other queer people.
So were you like, oh, that girl's cute, I think I'm going to try to hit her?
No, I'm way competitive with sports. And it was like, oh, these people are new. I don't even have time for them. I'm focused on our travel team and I'm moving up our rankings in the sport. And I'm like, I don't even have time. So I think I'm fortunate that she's less awkward than I am and would talk to me because I'm more like, oh, new skaters, you're in my way. I just need to knock you over and get on to the travel team practice.
So before we got on mics, we talked about how like now your life, you guys have recently bought a home, you have 2 kids, you guys are kind of living the Canadian dream. Do you guys have a Canadian dream?
I don't think so.
You're living the American dream in the Canadian version. So can you talk about how you found rebalancing yourself in the studio and finding time to make when you've got all these different things happening?
It was definitely a long process. Like there was times that I had to put other things before my studio practice. Like there's times that I didn't make much work at all, that I was just focusing on work or roller derby. Honestly, that took over a large part of my time for a bit there. But making the decision to prioritize my practice and step away from a few things and make decisions that will allow me to get the studio practice I want. The balance is, it's always been really tough. We have so many things going on. Like when I was involved in roller derby, that took up a big part of our time. And both of us were very involved in it, but got a little older and decided where our priorities lay. We wanted to have kids. I wanted to be able to focus on my studio practice. So at that time, my work hadn't changed yet, but we chose to, our son was born the year I retired from the sport. And I used the time from retiring from roller derby to be able to focus more on my studio practice and do more of the opportunities that I'd been having to put off, residencies or workshops, more just production, because I'd had other priorities. And it reached a point where we really liked that community, but we knew where we saw ourselves moving forward. And we had passions that we wanted to dedicate more time to. And part of that was our family. And that's been a long process, especially being like a queer couple. A family doesn't come as easy as it does for all families. And so we did have to put a lot of work into the planning that and making our jobs work together for a balance. And neither of us wanted to be a workaholic, but we did know we would like to have like a house at some point and not be renting and to have a bit of space so our kids can play. And I had been running 3 paint your own pottery studios for like 6 years in Ottawa. And it was great. And that's really where the color in my work came from, was being around those all the time. But it was deciding that wasn't going anywhere. So I'd actually started an apprenticeship as a stone and brick mason doing restoration because I liked that it was giving me my winters off. And that allowed me to focus on my family and on my studio practice. And I felt like this is perfect. Like I get to be outside all summer. I get this physical job, but I get all this time with my family and in the studio. And I figured that that's where that was going to be my balance. It was going to work out that way. Last summer, out of the blue, I got a phone call to take over a nonprofit pottery school. And I was like, oh, I don't know. I really like this apprenticeship. It's working well for my family. And just going through it and thinking like, this is actually the dream job. When I left ACAD, if I could have said, yeah, I'd love to run a pottery school and have access to all these kilns and to add all the new programs, I was like, I would have jumped at it 10 years earlier. So thinking about that, I made another switch. So it was a bit of a struggle, like just changing again. I felt greedy for my family doing that, but we have really, despite being in a pandemic, found a really nice balance now that between my wife's work and my own, our kids aren't in childcare. There's always one of us with them. We have 2 little boys now. We have a house outside the city with a yard that the kids and the dogs can play in. And it's pretty, I don't want to say perfect, but it checks a lot of the boxes of what we need.
So what's the name of that school? So
it's the Gloucester Pottery School.
People can find it online?
Yeah. It's just gloucesterpotteryschool.com. It's a nonprofit. We're partially funded by the city of Ottawa, and we're actually in a really amazing city of Ottawa building, Shankman Arts Center, that has a couple other schools within it. It has a big performing arts, actually 2 performing arts theaters. There's galleries. We actually have our own gallery as part of the school. So we teach classes and run groups and do camps and all kinds of things. And we can bring in artists for workshops, and really the sky's the limit there.
So I wanted to wrap up talking about Make and Do. Can you tell a little bit about why you're interested in being a part of that organization, and then also the exhibition that's coming up for that?
I loved Make and Do. Like I've only been a member for, I don't know, the last year, maybe less. It was Carol App and a bunch of these really amazing Canadian artists said, hey, there is amazing things going on in Canadian ceramics. And some of us know it, but it's so easy to just see what's in the magazines or showing up through sort of American publications. And they said, let's focus on Canadian, like hashtag Canadian ceramics. Let's celebrate our own. And it's not ever been about Canada only. It's just like, let's make sure we know what's going on here and support them and celebrate it. And Make and Do has done a lot to bring all the Canadians sort of out of the woodwork and make sure we all know about each other and to build this community. And I think that that's the important part. They're community building with their Canadian clay directory. Anyone working in clay, doesn't matter their skill level, for free, can join the directory and put your website and images and your contact information online. And you can find everyone. You just flip through and you're like, I had no idea there was so much talent across the country with new people joining all the time. Coming up for the Ceramics Congress, Make and Do is doing an online virtual sale through the website. So each of the Make and Do members is putting in a few pieces, but each artist is also invited 2 other Canadian artists. Some of them are names you might already know, but some of them are artists you maybe haven't come across before. So I think it opens at 10 Pacific Standard Time on the 26th. There'd be this really great virtual exhibition and sale of Canadian pots as part of Ceramic Congress.
Yeah, and that website is makeanddo.ca. And then people can find out more about the directory. And I encourage people to sign up for that. It's awesome for people like me. You know, when I'm looking for Canadian artists to interview, it is such an easy resource. So it's a good thing to be a part of.
I just don't know where we were before the directory. It's such a great tool. I think that every school must be telling their students, like, okay, you've graduated, put your name on the directory. Every guild should be doing that. Every organization, like, just get on there. Like, let's build community, because you know what? Sometimes if you're thinking about moving to a different part of Canada and you want to know what studios are there, well, the directory can help you connect with people right away. I know I was talking to somebody, they were in Toronto. I don't even know how they got my email, but they're like, oh, I'm new to Canada. I haven't really connected with anyone. I said, oh, Well, here's a Make and Do member in Toronto. They can help connect you to a whole bunch of the community there because they know everybody through the directory. And I just think it's this great way to connect people and to create more learning opportunities and more ceramics development kind of moving forward.
Well, I hear the kids in the background, so I think it's probably time to wrap it up. Can you leave your website as well as social media so people could get in touch?
Yeah, my website's at www.kaitlynbrennan.com, and my Instagram is Kaitlyn A. Brennan.
Well, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. That's great.
I'd like to thank Kaitlyn for taking the time to do this interview. It was a pleasure to chat with her. At the end of the interview, we started talking about the Canadian Clay Directory. If you're a Canadian maker and you're not a part of that, I encourage you to sign up. It is absolutely free and is sponsored by Make and Do. You can find out more information at makeanddo.ca. I'll be back tomorrow with the last installment of this year's Canada Week. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.